Production funding for Behind the Headlines is made possible in part by the WKNO Production Fund, the WKNO Endowment Fund, and by viewers like you. Thank you.
Tammy Sawyer runs for mayor, the city and Graceland reach a tentative deal, and much more tonight on Behind the Headlines. I'm Eric Barnes, president and executive editor of the Daily Memphian. Thanks for joining us. This week we've got a roundtable of journalists talking about some of the biggest stories of the week. Toby Sells is news editor at the Memphis Flyer. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Eric.
Karanja Janaku, editor of the Tri-State Defender. Thanks for being here again.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Along with Bill Dries, reporter with the Daily Memphian. Tammy Sawyer, yesterday, as we taped this, Bill, on Thursday, she announced her run for the mayor of City of Memphis against Jim Strickland, the incumbent, and former mayor Willie Harrington is also declared. How does this shape up?
This shapes up to be a really good discussion among the mayoral candidates, and it also amounts to some very different views of the city's future. Of course, the Strickland campaign's slogan has been Memphis has momentum. Sawyer thinks that the city has some very serious problems that need to be addressed. And Harrington's vantage point on this has been, things were fine when I was mayor, let's do it again.
Yeah. Karanja, your thoughts? Tammy comes in part out of this kind of protest movement. She was on the back of that, I think, got into county commission, now looking at the mayor's office. I don't know that people were necessarily surprised that eventually Tammy wouldn't run for one of the mayor's seats, but your thoughts?
We actually interviewed her earlier in the week, so our story that's out today goes in depth in terms of why she's going. One of the things that sticks out to me is that she defines herself in this particular story as a social issues candidate. And so I think her point is that, hey, we appreciate the efforts that people have done up to this far, but we can do better, and we can do things faster, and we need to change the tenor of the conversation and put social issues at the top of the agenda and let that affect policies and programs.
Social issues being an example being?
She talks a lot about we need to make sure we look at what we're going to do about recidivism and people coming out of prison and coming back into the communities. She talks about the fact that there's so much poverty in Memphis, and she thinks that that understanding about poverty, particularly as it relates to children, should be paramount in discussions. She talks about education, and while the city doesn't really fund education directly anymore, she says that maybe we need to take another look at that, because education ties into our ability to attract industry.
Toby, your thoughts on Tammy Sawyer running for mayor?
I've seen her in action at the county commission one day when they were talking about juvenile justice reform, talking about the new building they wanted to build over there. So I've seen her in action, and she does come from that kind of activist world, grassroots world, but I think it's translated really well onto the other side of that bench. She can talk the lingo, she knows the issues, and she knows how to say it, but also what she wants to say, and she puts it together in a really good package.
It would be fascinating. We talk about former Mayor Harrington. We talk, who is a beloved figure and a controversial figure, depending on who you talk to. Tammy, this kind of new generation of Memphis politician, and then Strickland in that mix is a little bit more the sort of, I wouldn't say conservative, but the more traditional, it seems like. It would be a fascinating debate if we get to that, Bill. It would be must-watch TV.
And hopefully we will have that debate, and probably right here. But I think that Strickland, first and foremost, is the incumbent who is running on his record of the last 4 years. Aside from that, though, this is very much, I think, a generational mayor's race. You have different generations, different priorities in this, and I think it has the potential to be a really good discussion about the city's future.
Yeah. Other thoughts on this before we move on?
About the part about generational, I think one of the things that's interesting to me about Sawyer's entry into the race is that it's not just a millennial kind of thing. I mean, if you look at Sawyer and how she did in her particular district, she has shown the ability to attract generations, okay, and and I think that could potentially be a winning formula for her.
We've also got, go ahead, Bill.
What I also see happening in this is that 4 years ago we had a mayor's race that was very much about Memphians not being happy with where the city was going, the execution of plans that were being made, too much talk about plans. Jim Strickland didn't invent that, didn't create that, but he certainly capitalized it and rode that to victory. There is still that kind of discontent out there. Maybe it's at a different level, but that kind of questioning of where the city is and where it's going and its long-term direction is still present.
Yeah. That's right. We also, it'll be election year. We'll do a couple of election updates and move on, but city council races and so on. You want to give us a quick update, Bill, on how those are shaping up this year?
Sure. All 13 of the Memphis City Council seats will be on the ballot this year as well, and you have a lot of action so far in the 2 Super District 9 seats held by Kemp Conrad and Reed Hedgepeth, who are term limited and cannot seek another term in office. Chase Carlisle with Avison and Young is considering running for one of the Super District 9 seats. You have Cody Fletcher who is running for one of the Super District seats. You also have, announcing this week, Jeff Warren, who was formerly on the Memphis City Schools Board, who is running for Super District 9, the position that Hedgepeth holds. And on top of that, former City Council member Myron Lowry, who left the council at the end of 2015, says he's done with retirement and he will be running for City Court Clerk this year.
All right. One thing that certainly will be a topic in this whole conversation of the mayor's race and probably city council is incentives. And Toby, you brought up that Mayor Harris on the county side took some jabs at incentives. He did that when he was running. He did that in his State of the County address. Thoughts on where the role incentives play at an interesting time where Electrolux, we mentioned on the show with City Council last week, they are leaving. A lot of frustration that there are no clawbacks in place for a lot of the cash payout incentives that were given to them. A lot of discussion about how the pilot tax abatement incentives worked or didn't work. How does this all play out?
It's been interesting since Electrolux left, and then that was kind of not a failure or whatever. But then just a few days after that, FedEx announced they were going to move some of their offices downtown. They got a huge incentive package, and I think a lot of people were kind of reeling between the two, like, this thing didn't work, and now we're going to do it again. It started a kind of a debate, I think, that has been out there, kind of rumbled about, but not had such a high profile. Again, candidate Mayor Lee Harris talked about it in his election run, but then in the State of the County, he said, I'm not even sure that any incentive has ever, public incentive has ever created a private job. It was enough of a discussion where last Friday, Mayor Strickland put in his weekly update, a little explanation about what pilots were, how they worked, TDZs and the TIFs and that kind of alphabet soup of incentives. And then in the Daily Memphian, Dan Conaway wrote a column kind of criticizing some of these incentives and said, we need to help people. And that was enough where Kyle Veazey wrote, who's the COO of Memphis, City of Memphis, Deputy CO.
Yeah, former communications person.
And he wrote a column kind of in response to that explained a lot of this stuff, that said, we're not giving cash to these big companies. It's kind of a different thing. But I think it shows that the conversation about these incentives, it's getting larger and larger and more steam and higher profile. I think it's going to be something we're going to be talking about really soon.
Yeah, it was interesting to talk to City Council last week. Kemp Conrad, who was on the council when the Electrolux passed, and then the very new members, Cheyenne Johnson and Sherman Greer. And their line was, and I don't mean it in that cynically, but their line was that, well, that Electrolux was done at a time when the economy was, it was the Great Recession. We were just so happy to get any jobs, and we wouldn't have done that again. We wouldn't do that now, particularly without particularly the cash incentives, because that's the thing, Carnes, that people get so angry about, is when these big companies with a lot of money get cash incentives to move to Memphis or move nearby. the people on the other side of it, Calvisi, for instance, in his guest column that he wrote for us, talk about how the vast majority of this is really just tax abatements, where the city or county is getting very little tax. They could potentially get this tax, but to get the building in there, they get this level of tax. That was Eric Math right there. To what extent do you hear that? Do you hear criticisms, these are the frustrations, or is it not about that? Is it about the social issues that, for instance, Tammy Sawyer talks about?
Well, I think it's all of that, but what I hear is an evolving conversation that's beyond incentives. I mean, incentives sort of fits into this larger discussion about economic development. What is economic development? Mm-hmm. When they say that things are booming downtown and there's all of this development, who is it benefiting? I mean, some would argue that it's benefiting a small group of developers, and it's not trickling down, that trickling down doesn't even work, right, and that we need to just re-examine how we're going about assessing economic development, and so that's really the conversation that I hear more, and that we need to have that at a higher level.
And I'll say that we have a show next week talking about neighborhood level efforts with blight remediation and community revitalization. And you know, Bill, it was interesting because we pre-taped that show, so that'll air next week, when we talk about these big projects, you know, FedEx moving downtown in multi-millions, or Union Row, this proposed massive redevelopment right downtown, and the kind of, you know, what Kranja's talking about. To talk to those people who are working on the neighborhood level, it's lot by lot, 5 lots together, converting those, rehabbing those. I mean, the contrast is really stark, and not in necessarily a bad way, but it's very stark of what it takes at the neighborhood level in impoverished areas, abandoned areas. What it takes to rebuild them is more than just money and tax incentives. It's all this incredible amount of hard work.
Right, and we hear so much about this money is in this pocket and it can only be used for this. But also, you think about the amounts that are involved in the incentives, and you look at, I mean, I think it's a natural tendency, I think it's a healthy tendency to look at those amounts of incentives and think, okay, if we put that into neighborhood revitalization, if we could, if there weren't the pockets that everybody talks about, what would we be able to
right.
do if that money could be allocated for that? The other note about the incentives discussion is that Electrolux announced it was moving just ahead of FedEx Logistics moving into the Gibson Guitar Factory, and the problem with Electrolux was that the amount of incentives was pretty close to the amount of investment that right. Electrolux was going to do originally. And as it turns out, the amount of incentives for the FedEx Logistics move are actually greater to some degree than the investment that FedEx would make in the building itself. Right. Now, the salaries that FedEx would pay at the logistics headquarters are much higher than the Electrolux jobs, but the timing of these two things, Electrolux and FedEx, kind of worked to bring right. this discussion up again.
One last thing, at least specifically on incentives, it's interesting. I mean, even just this week we wrote about some very small incentives given in Whitehaven, and some the whole effort by EDGE, which does these incentives, and the city, Mayor Strickland has rolled out this idea of doing neighborhood level tax incentives, particularly in underserved areas. And it'll be interesting to see, just from a pure campaign point of view, how much he leans on that, and then how much money really is going into these smaller projects, not the big FedEx level projects or the Union Row projects, but neighborhood level restaurants and so on and so forth. I'll segue a little bit to the city, and as I mentioned at the top of the show, City of Memphis and Graceland, speaking of incentives and public-private partnerships and all that sort of stuff, have announced a tentative deal to move forward with a lot of development in the Graceland area. And they basically, as I read it, I don't know who wants to take this, Bill, maybe start, that have tabled the whole controversy about the arena. They have not settled the controversy of an arena, which gets back to the whole non-compete with the Grizzlies and no public assistance of any sort for an arena over 5,000 seats, which Graceland would like to do. But they're going to move forward on some other things. Is that right?
Yes, they're going to move forward on more space for sound stages, They're going to move forward on some cabins, relocating the RV park. They're also going to move forward on a manufacturing facility that will not be on the Graceland campus, but will be somewhere in Whitehaven. Joel Weinshanker, the managing partner of Graceland Holdings, also owns the company that makes Chia Pets and the Clapper.
This is true.
This is true.
Wow.
And so his idea is move the manufacturing of that and some other products similar to that to Whitehaven and sell the products in a number of places, obviously around the world, but also sell it at a Made in Memphis retail center that is part of the Graceland complex.
We've officially blown Toby Sell's mind. You apparently did not know about the Chia Pet connection to Graceland.
It takes a lot sometimes to blow my mind, but that's the first time I've ever heard those things together. That was a great moment for me. Thank you.
So in this manufacturing plant, which on the serious side is 1,000 jobs that are involved, Whitehaven residents would be given first preference on the jobs. The pay scale is supposed to be a living wage for those jobs. Right. The city will back Graceland's application for new market tax credits and other incentives specifically for the manufacturing.
Thoughts on this, Ron?
Yeah, along that line, I mean, as I understand it, there's like a community business agreement, right? And that there's an element of money that comes from the development that is then funneled back into the community. And there's supposed to be a creation of or selection of a nonprofit group that the city council would designate that would oversee that element of it. And so that would be interesting to see what the nonprofit group would be. But I do find it intriguing, this idea about designating a pool of money from the development that you're going to funnel back into the community.
Who holds them accountable on that?
It's $750,000 over 5 years, and a nonprofit would basically administer the use of these funds.
Who would hold them accountable to what Karanja just said? I mean, a lot of this frustration is, about these incentives and these partnerships and this government support of these companies is about that accountability. Again, back to Electrolux, that there were no clawback provisions, no provisions that if they left before a certain period of time, you could get the cash back. So what's the accountability built into this Graceland deal?
There are some specific timelines when it comes to the manufacturing facilities that you have to have it ready to build by a certain date, which I think that is at the end of the year. It has to be open and producing at the job level promised. I believe it's by the end of 2023 for that. One other note of interest, what also is not in this agreement is a deal on the expansion of Guest House at Graceland. Guest House at Graceland, the resort hotel, the third largest hotel in the city, wants to build another wing. We've had the mayor on the show before saying that he does not believe that incentives are necessary from local government since the resort hotel is doing so well. That is not a part of the agreement. There's nothing that bars Graceland from doing that on its own, but that's not mentioned in the agreement.
And to be clear, they could build their own arena without public incentives, right? I mean, no one could stop them from doing that. It's a lot of this is that question of public incentives, right?
And that is before the state appeals court at this point, and both sides have agreed that will determine what happens in the future on that.
I think the accountability thing too gets back to us in large measure. I mean, when I say us, I mean the press. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I know that we've taken a more aggressive posture in terms of how we're going to go about covering business, put more people on it. I just think, generally speaking, the press in Memphis has to drill down on this and a lot of other issues.
Well, and one last note, just on going to Graceland and incentives and the whole thing, I think that's where people get confused. You'll hear the mayor say we have momentum, and yet we still need to give all these incentives to, and he'll say to keep that momentum going, right? And then he can, pick and choose and say, well, we don't need to give it to Graceland because they're already doing great, And then who do we give these things to? I think that becomes kind of a part of the conversation that confuses people and makes them question it.
Well, the thing too about momentum is, momentum suggests movement, but all movement is in progress, right? And so I think, again, it gets back to what I was saying, that our job relative to the media is to examine these statements about momentum and be able to write and talk about them in such a way that people can make good decisions come election time.
Well, you talk about accountability. I'm going to take a side note here. You and I had dinner recently with folks from Bruce Van Weingarten from The Flyer, from Madeline Faber, who's off on the show, from High Ground, Wendy Thomas from MLK 50, Mark Russell from the Commercial Appeal, Joanna Krangle from Memphis Business Journal, and Cynthia Jones from Chalkbeat. And it was really cool, and it was all off the record, and it was just us talking. But it was actually really interesting that that many independent, there's partnerships, but basically independent news organizations were all there, all talking about issues like this and what, how we hold people accountable. And so it was an interesting note. And when you talk about the role of the press, there's been so much talk about, the death of the press and cutbacks, and it has been brutal. But it was a heartening moment, I thought, in terms of the lively and active press independent press that does exist in Memphis.
Well, while we swore a blood oath not to give the specifics too much, but one of the things that we did talk about was that we're not starting from scratch in terms of the conversation, and that you can look at Philadelphia and what they're doing with one of their sort of collective projects, and they take a project and then this consortium writes and does broadcast about it. And then they can put them on their individual sites, and it's very possible that that we could do that here. Yeah. But I just know that we have to step up as a press.
Yeah. 6 minutes left here. You want to talk about Governor Bill Lee? The session, the legislative session, is in full force. Lots of bills being talked about. It's that strange time where things are floated and behind the scenes they have no chance, and things that are actually really priorities are kind of moving in stealth mode. But just some things that have caught your eye, Karan.
Sure. I think 3 areas caught my eye. One was what he's talking about relative to criminal justice reform. His position seems to be that we got to do something, first of all, but that there's a way to move smartly and just at the same time, and he has some things there he's proposing. We talked about he has a big interest in vocational education. Of course, he comes out of that world. But maybe the most controversial deal is going to be this whole education process, the parental choice. It's sort of his version of how we're going to go about this vouchers situation. Yeah. And as I understand this one, it provides parental choice. They would get students from certain districts would then be able to go to independent schools of their choice. You would get this sort of like debit card with $7,300 that you could apply toward that. Well, that's untested in a lot of areas, and when you do the math on it, in terms of how many students would be eligible the first year and $7,300, it sort of comes out more than what he's set aside for the program as a whole. So there's some questions there, but he seems bent on trying to move forward this voucher conversation, which has failed consistently over the years.
The bills that have been brought up. Brian Kelsey, state senator, who's been on the show from Germantown, has brought one up. A lot of variations on these voucher programs and different names for them. So it will be interesting. I mean, they've got the Republicans have a big majority. Bill Lee's making a priority of it, but it's just never gotten there. And it'll be curious if even on a pilot level they can pull that off. With a couple of minutes left, there is a cannabis discussion, as always, legislation, I think, discussion at the state level, right. Also at the city council level. Toby Sells.
There's a couple of bills up, I think both of them are sponsored by Senator Sarah Kyle from Memphis. One would decriminalize possession of certain amounts of marijuana. I think it's under an ounce or something around in there, I can't remember. The other one would drop any kind of arrest or anything like that from people that have medical marijuana, say in Arkansas. If you're found with it in Memphis, then they wouldn't prosecute you. The Memphis City Council voted last week. It was a split decision, but they voted in a resolution to support any kind of cannabis legislation in Nashville. Got some pushback, understandably. I know the Director Michael Rawlings doesn't like any kind of medical or any kind of marijuana legislation. So it'll be an interesting discussion as it goes on to see if this really has legs this year.
And you talked about criminal justice. I mean, for a lot of people, we make a bunch of jokes, and I'm refraining from making jokes about this. I might later, but it is for a lot of people. This decriminalization of small amounts of marijuana and even just legalization is a criminal justice issue, because that is the first point of entry for so many people with small amounts of marijuana entering the criminal justice system. So there's a lot more to it than just letting people smoke pot, right?
Right, and then there's also just the whole issue of the people that we put in jail. That's beyond the whole sort of cannabis deal, and so people are arguing that we're putting people in jail that really don't need to be there, and that there's some other options for being able to handle their transgressions, and I think that discussion needs to be looked at in depth.
With just a minute left, Bill, I think it was your story about, but we did a story about this conversation about affordable housing going into Uptown, just north of downtown. There's already some subsidized, what I would call subsidized housing, some affordable housing. There was a proposal that went to council for another project to go in there, and Berlin Boyd, former chair who represents that district, spoke passionately and adamantly against allowing more because of problems that came from the affordable housing that's there.
And the council actually voted down this development by Elmington Capital, which is a group out of Nashville, and the story actually was by Tom Bailey. But the rents here would have started at about $700 a month. The average rents in downtown on a fair market basis are about $900 to $1,000 a month. And Boyd put the weight of being that district councilman behind it, and the project went down, and it was an interesting moment in the development of Uptown.
It really was an interesting debate, a very good story that was handled by, as you said, Tom Bailey. We've run out of time. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for joining us, and join us again next week.